You're at a backyard fire pit on a Saturday night, and the wind shifts, and suddenly you're standing directly in a wall of smoke. Your eyes water, your throat tightens. Every rational cell in your body screams, "Move," and you do. You take 3 steps to the left and keep talking to your friends like nothing happened. That's the modern reaction to smoke. Annoyance. Now imagine a version of you that didn't move. A version of you, or rather your ancestor, who leaned in. That single decision, leaning toward the smoke instead of away from it, might be one of the strangest and most consequential choices in the entire story of our species. And it happened long before written language, long before agriculture, long before anyone had a word for ritual or medicine or high. It happened in the dark, around a fire, in a world where a wrong decision usually meant you didn't wake up the next morning. So here's the impossible situation. You are a human being, roughly 1,000,000 years ago. You have no medicine, no painkillers, no understanding of infection, inflammation, or why your chest sometimes fills with fluid and you can't breathe. Your entire toolkit for survival is fire, stone, and whatever your senses can teach you through trial and error, where the errors are frequently fatal. And somewhere in that brutal, unforgiving environment, a behavior emerges that has nothing to do with hunting or building or fighting. A behavior that looks, on the surface, completely irrational, deliberately breathing in the byproduct of combustion. On purpose, repeatedly. Why would evolution allow that? Why would a species obsessed with avoiding danger start chasing smoke? To answer that, we have to go back to the very first fires our ancestors ever controlled. And the answer is going to force you to rethink what primitive actually means. Start with Wonderwork Cave, tucked into the interior of South Africa. Inside, archaeologists uncovered burnt bone fragments and ash deposits dating back roughly 1,000,000 years. Not scattered debris from a wildfire that swept through by accident, but the layered residue of fire maintained in one spot over and over, inside a sheltered space. That's not luck. That's management. That's a creature. And remember, this predates Homo sapiens entirely. This is Homo erectus we're talking about, deliberately keeping a flame alive night after night. Which means for hundreds of thousands of years before our species even existed, someone was sitting exactly where you'd sit at a fire pit tonight and breathing exactly what you'd breathe. Except they weren't breathing it for 30 seconds before stepping away. They were breathing it for hours, every night, for their entire lives. Think about the sheer scale of that exposure, generation after generation, marinated in smoke from birth to death. If there was ever going to be a species primed to notice something unusual about what smoke does to the body and mind, and here's where it gets strange. Wood smoke by itself is mostly unpleasant. It stings, it chokes, it's not exactly a party, but early humans weren't only burning wood. Depending on where they lived, they were burning whatever grew nearby. And sometimes what grew nearby wasn't neutral. Some plants, when they combust, release compounds that do something to the human nervous system. Not toxic, exactly. Active, noticeable. The kind of thing that makes a tired, hungry hunter suddenly feel like the night isn't quite so cold. The exhaustion isn't quite so heavy. Now pause and ask yourself an uncomfortable question. What happens biologically when a human brain encounters a compound like that for the first time? Here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. The human brain isn't a blank slate reacting to something totally foreign. We have an entire internal signaling network, the endocannabinoid system, built into our biology for regulating mood, appetite, memory, stress response. It didn't evolve because of any plant. It evolved because our own bodies produce similar compounds naturally, which means when a prehistoric human first inhaled smoke carrying plant-based versions of those same signals, their brain wasn't confused by an intruder. It recognized a familiar shape. It responded like a lock meeting a key it didn't know it had. That's not superstition. That's neurochemistry. And it means the very first high in human history probably wasn't a decision at all. It was an accident that felt suspiciously, unmistakably good, repeated by instinct, remembered by instinct, and eventually, deliberately recreated. Sit with that for a second, because it reframes everything that comes next. We tend to imagine ancient humans as constantly one bad decision away from death, stumbling through survival with no room for anything beyond food and shelter. But this behavior suggests something else entirely. It suggests they were paying close attention to their own internal experience, testing it, remembering it, and acting on it with intention. That's not animal instinct. That's the beginning of something closer to experimentation. But intentional experimentation raises a much bigger problem. If early humans were deliberately seeking out this feeling, how do we prove it? You can't carbon date a feeling. You can't excavate a good mood. So what does the actual evidence look like? And how far back does it really go? This is where the story takes its first hard turn, because the honest answer from archaeology is messier than you'd expect. Wait, it actually gets more interesting than that. In 2019, researchers digging in the Great Salt Lake Desert in Utah uncovered a hearth roughly 12,000 years old. Inside it, they found seeds from a wild tobacco species native to the region, not scattered randomly the way debris blows into a fire, concentrated, clustered in a way that strongly suggests someone put them there on purpose. This site predates any pipes, any pottery, any smoking paraphernalia found anywhere nearby by thousands of years. Which means somebody 12,000 years ago in what's now the American West was throwing a psychoactive plant into a fire long before humans had invented a single tool designed specifically for smoking anything. That should stop you in your tracks. 12,000 years is older than the pyramids by roughly 7,000 years. Older than written language. Older than the wheel. And it's tobacco use with zero equipment, zero infrastructure, just raw behavioral intent. Now here's the myth you need to let go of immediately. The idea that smoking is a vice that crept in alongside modern decadence, alongside cities and leisure time and boredom, is almost backwards. The evidence points the opposite direction. This behavior appears to be older than civilization itself, not a byproduct of it. So if the behavior is that old, what did it actually look like once humans started refining it? Because there's a massive difference between a hunter accidentally inhaling something interesting and a fully developed cultural practice with rules, tools, and meaning behind it. For that, travel to Central Asia, to a cluster of ancient burial mounds in the Pamir Mountains, dated to roughly 500 BC. Excavators pulled wooden braziers out of the ground, containers built specifically to hold heated stones. Alongside them, they found the residue of cannabis, not the low-potency wild variety used for fiber or rope. This was a version selected, whether through cultivation or careful gathering, for its psychoactive strength, placed deliberately in a burial context, which tells you this wasn't casual. This was ceremonial. Someone believed this substance belonged with the dead on their way to wherever they were going next. And this wasn't an isolated cultural quirk. Around the same era, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote about a nomadic people called the Scythians, describing a strange practice he witnessed firsthand. Small enclosed tents, stones heated until glowing, hemp seeds thrown directly onto them, and people sitting inside inhaling the resulting vapor while, in his words, howling with pleasure. For centuries afterward, historians treated this description as exaggeration, the kind of embellished travel story ancient writers were known for. Then archaeologists actually excavated Scythian burial sites and found bronze braziers, heated stones, and hemp residue. Precisely what Herodotus described, sitting in the ground exactly where he said it would be. He wasn't inventing anything. He was reporting with total accuracy, something so far outside his own cultural experience that later generations assumed he must be lying. That should make you a little uneasy about how confidently we dismiss ancient accounts as myth. Sometimes the myth turns out to be the most literal description on record. But here's the twist that changes the entire emotional tone of this story. This wasn't recreational the way we think of recreational today. Smoke, in almost every ancient culture where we find this evidence, was treated as something closer to sacred technology. Nowhere is that clearer than in the Americas, where tobacco originated. When Columbus and his crew arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, they described something baffling. Local people walking around holding small, glowing bundles, inhaling smoke and releasing it slowly through their nose and mouth. Columbus's own men were confused enough to write about it, and confused enough to try it themselves within weeks. That part hasn't changed much about human nature. But tobacco use in the Americas long predates any European contact. Chemical residue analysis of ancient pipes in the southeastern United States pushes tobacco use back at least 3,500 years, and some researchers argue the roots go back considerably further, tangled up with the earliest cultivation efforts in the Amazon basin. And critically, this wasn't a casual habit passed around like a modern cigarette break. Tobacco in indigenous American cultures functioned as a bridge. It was used to seal agreements between rival groups, to communicate with the spirit world, to bless and heal. When a shaman exhaled smoke over someone, that gesture carried the weight of an oath. The smoke itself was treated as a kind of messenger, carrying intention upward and bringing insight back down. You don't treat a messenger like that carelessly. You don't chain smoke a sacred oath, which raises an uncomfortable comparison. Somewhere between a shaman blowing ceremonial smoke over a dying relative and a modern person lighting a cigarette on a smoke break outside an office building, something enormous got lost in translation. Same act, almost nothing else in common. We'll come back to that gap, because it matters. But first, There's another layer to this story that almost never gets mentioned, and it completely upends how we think about ancient medicine. Wait, it gets even more impressive than ritual and ceremony. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical texts on the planet, written in Egypt around 1550 BC, describes treatments for lung and throat conditions that involve inhaling smoke from specific heated herbs. Ancient Egyptian doctors were treating respiratory illness with smoke. From a modern perspective, that sounds like using fire to cure a house that's already burning. But some of the herbs referenced, including henbane, actually contained compounds with real pharmacological effects when inhaled. The logic wasn't as backwards as it first appears. Smoke reaches the lungs almost instantly. If a plant has medicinal properties, inhalation is one of the fastest possible ways to deliver it into the body. The ancient Greeks did something remarkably similar, a practice called fumigation, and Hippocrates himself, yes, the man behind the oath every doctor still takes today, wrote about using inhaled herbal vapor to treat lung disease. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, ancient Ayurvedic medicine in India, dating back more than 3,000 years, described a formal practice of inhaling medicinal herb smoke through pipes, with detailed instructions on which plants to use for which condition. This wasn't guesswork. This was an organized, refined medical system, passed down and improved across centuries. Completely separate civilizations, with no contact, no shared language, independently arrived at the same basic conclusion. Inhaled smoke can be medicine. That's not coincidence. That's convergent discovery. The same way completely unrelated cultures independently invented agriculture, pottery, and the wheel. When multiple isolated groups land on the same solution, it usually means the solution actually works, at least well enough, often enough, to be worth repeating. And there's a reason this behavior spread so effectively that has nothing to do with plants or medicine at all. Humans are not built to survive alone. For most of our history, being cut off from the group was closer to a death sentence than an inconvenience, which means anything that strengthened trust and cohesion inside a group had enormous survival value. And shared, synchronized experiences, several people entering an altered state together at the same time, are one of the most powerful bonding tools that exist. Modern neuroscience backs this up directly. Group rituals synchronize brain activity between participants and measurably deepen trust and social bonding. So when a cluster of ancient humans sat together in a closed tent, breathing in the same rising smoke, sharing the same shift in perception, that wasn't idle recreation. That was infrastructure. That was the social glue that let a scattered group of individuals function, hunt, migrate, and survive as one coordinated unit. Which brings us to the part of the story that stops being fascinating and starts being genuinely difficult to sit with. Everything up to this point describes something ancient, deliberate, and in its own strange way. Then tobacco reached Europe in the 16th century, and something in that equation broke completely. Within decades of contact, tobacco went from an unfamiliar curiosity to a continental fixation. By the 1700s, snuff was fashionable among European elites. By the 1800s, cigars were everywhere. By the early 20th century, industrial manufacturing had produced the modern cigarette, a product engineered to be cheaper, faster, and more addictive than anything that came before it. What took indigenous cultures thousands of years to develop into a careful, meaningful practice was compressed by industrial capitalism into a mass-market commodity in roughly 4 centuries. And the 20th century made it worse. Internal industry research confirming the link between cigarettes and cancer was buried for decades. Products were engineered specifically to hit the brain faster and harder. Advertising targeted teenagers directly. A plant once treated with the reverence of a spiritual messenger was systematically stripped of every trace of ritual and reverence, then optimized purely for profit and dependency. That gap between a Scythian howling with genuine joy inside a ceremonial tent and a tobacco executive signing off on advertising aimed at children is one of the widest moral distances you'll find anywhere in human history. Both involve smoke. Almost nothing else survived the transition. So where does that leave the original question? When did this all actually begin? The honest answer is we don't know exactly. And we probably never will with total certainty. Physical evidence takes us back at least 12,000 years with real confidence. The underlying instinct, the drive to alter consciousness, to mark meaningful moments with shared inhaled experience, to reach for smoke as medicine, almost certainly stretches back much further than any artifact we've managed to dig up. Organic material rarely survives. A wooden pipe rots. A leather pouch dissolves. Stone tools last for millions of years, specifically because stone doesn't decay. That means the absence of older evidence isn't proof this behavior is younger. It's proof that fragile evidence rarely survives long enough for us to find it. What we can say with confidence is this. By the time any civilization on Earth started writing things down, this behavior was already fully established, already loaded with ritual, medicine, and meaning. It didn't emerge with agriculture. It didn't emerge with cities. It may be as old as the moment some early human first looked at a burning plant and thought, "That's not recklessness. That's the earliest version of a scientific mind at work, testing cause and effect against the only laboratory available, its own body." So go back to that backyard fire pit. The wind shifts. The smoke hits your face, and you step aside without a second thought, because to you, it's just smoke. But somewhere behind that instinct is 100,000 years of humans who didn't step aside. Who leaned in instead? Who turned a byproduct of survival into medicine, into ceremony, into the glue that held their communities together in the dark? The smell in the air tonight is the same smell that drifted through Homo erectus campsites 1,000,000 years before your species even existed. Every time you catch that scent and don't think twice about it, you're standing at the tail end of one of the oldest continuous threads in human history. You're not just smelling smoke, you're smelling something your ancestors spent 100,000 years learning to understand.